You may have noticed that although we haven't really explained to you yet all pieces of our programs, most of them have the same structure. And it is this structure that I want to explain to you a little bit more right now. And I'll put some comments into this code to help you see what this structure is. Most of our programs start with this # include stdio.h in these angular brackets. That's called a preprocessor directive. And it's a directive that is really meant for the preprocessor, which is something that happens before the compiler actually starts translating your code. We'll understand this in much more detail much later. For now, we just know here are the preprocessor directives. Then right here, our main function starts. Every program has to have a main function, just like this one right here. We will later on see that we can have more than one function, but only one of them can be called main, and there has to be one that is called main. So that's typically right there. Then inside a function, we always have some variable declarations at the top, even though we haven't talked about variables yet. So for now, that's just a word, but we'll understand this soon. Then further down, we have executable statements. So far, we have focused on those and trying to understand what these statements do. So we have the for loop here that repeats 3 times, and then we have these printf statements that print something out. And finally, our function will always end with a return statement. So it's always going to be a return statement at the end of all of our functions. Those are the major structural parts of the programs that we'll be writing for now, and most of our programs will have these.
How do you repeat multiple times a specific instruction? For example, here I have a printf hello world with a new line, and I want to repeat it 5 times. Well, I copy this instruction and then I paste it 5 times, 3, 4, 5. If I compile and run the program, I have 5 times in the terminal, hello world. Well, there is another way to repeat an instruction with a loop. So let me edit and I will show you how to do that. To repeat this instruction 5 times. So what I do is I use a special loop that is called the for loop. The first step is to add a new line at the beginning of the main here, and to write int space I space, you don't need this space, but equals space, you don't need this one either, 0, semicolon. You don't have to understand this instruction right now because you don't know what variables are, and you will see that further in the course. Second step, you have to write the for loop. So for now, we will just copy paste this code here. So let me just paste it. And the only thing you have to remember is this number here, 9, for example. Let me change it to 5. So this number will be the number of times you will repeat the instruction. Which one? Well, at the end of the for here, I add opening brace and then I hit enter. As you can see, we have the corresponding closing brace here. And within these opening and closing braces, I can put some code that will be repeated a certain number of times. And the number is the number that is written just here, 5. So let me copy paste this printf here within the for loop, within the braces here. And if I compile and if I execute the code, you can see in the terminal that the printf hello world new line is repeated 5 times. Let me edit and change the number here to 9 and then compile and run, and we have 9 times hello world. So for now, we know how to loop, repeat a certain number of times an instruction. You have to change the number here you have to put this special line at the beginning of the main, and you have to copy paste the 4, change the number here, 9 with the number you want, and within the braces, opening and closing braces here, you have to put the instruction you want to repeat a certain number of times. For now, we have only one instruction, but we'll see that we can put multiple expressions and multiple instructions here. Also, maybe you've noticed that the printf is a little bit offset. You have an indentation here. As for the other instructions here, you have a certain indentation. It doesn't start at the beginning of the line. This is for clarity reasons, but it doesn't matter. So if I put the printf here or the printf here, what matters is the opening and closing braces. And the indentation is for clarity reasons. You will see that further in the course, that you need to have this indentation for clarity reason. Here, we can see that the printf is within a loop, the for loop. That's why we put a little bit more of indentation, but it doesn't matter. You can put as many indentation and offsets you want. Well, try to use this loop yourself. Try to modify the number here and try to execute and see what's happening in the output.
Let's look at another loop example. We just learned how to do basic loop, and I'll just copy and paste what we learned so far in here. So we need to have this funny line int I equals 0, which we'll explain later, and then this for I equals 0, I less than 3, I plus plus. We'll repeat a task 3 times. This 3 indicates how many times we repeat the task. What is the thing we want to repeat? Well, let's open some curly braces. They automatically close themselves. And why don't we just print something? So how about printf blah? Put a semicolon right here. This will simply print blah 3 times right after each other. I did not put a new line character \n after blah, so it'll print this just 3 times. Let's give it a try. I compile, and when I run this code, indeed it says blah, 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 just like we expected. Let's go back to edit mode, and let's add a second statement here. Why don't we also print blee right underneath the blah? And while we're at it, why don't we add a third printf statement? Blee. And this time I'm going to put a space behind that. So what's that going to do? We expect this to print blah, blee, blee, and a space after the blee. So the blah, blee, blee will be smacked together, and then there's going to be a space, and then we're going to repeat the whole thing 3 times. So all on one line, we expect to see blah, blah, blee, blah, blah, blee, blah, blah, blee, and the 3 instances should be separated by a space. Let's go take a look. Compile, and we run the code, and indeed we see blah, blah, blee, blah, blah, blee, and blah, blah, blee. Let's go back to edit mode. How about we start a new line, and how can I do that? I simply put in a printf statement, and the only thing I need there is a \n to tell C it's time to start a new line. And how about now we put in a second loop? But this time, let's have it repeated 6 times. So we copy the loop header that we had before, but instead of repeating 3 times, let's repeat 6 times. Automatically, when I open my curly brace, a closing curly brace appears. And this time, let's print, where are we? Low and blue. Let's think about this first before we compile and run. First, the first loop is going to be executed, and this loop tells us whatever is inside the curly braces, namely these 3 statements, is going to be repeated 3 times. So blah, blah, blee is printed 3 times, and the blah, blee, and blee are smacked together, except after blee there's a space, and so we say blah, blah, blee, space, blah, 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 space, blah, 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 space. Then a new line is started. And next, we start another loop. This one repeats what's inside the curly braces 6 times. So inside the curly braces, I see blow and blue. And again, let's put a space behind the second statement so that I can see the 6 print outputs from the loop separated from each other. So I expect to see blue, blue, space, blue, blue, space, blue, blue, space 6 times on one line. So let's compile and run. And indeed, there it is, blah, 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 3 times on the first line, and the next line contains 6 repetitions of blue, blue. So now we understand loops much better. A loop has the ability to repeat what's inside the curly braces as many times as you wish, and that number of times goes right there. When you start with 0, it goes right there. And what is inside, we can choose whatever we want to put in there. We can have 2 statements, 3 statements, or whatever number of statements we wish inside the loop.
Let's go through the common errors, syntactic errors, compilation errors, when you use the for loop, the repetition loop. Let's try this program first. So I compile and run. So it's running normally, and we have a repetition of this instruction, hello world, with 2 printf within a repetition loop. So we repeat 3 times these 2 lines, hello and then world, and then a new line. And that's exactly what we get in the terminal. So let's go back to edit mode, and then we will insert some of the errors and see what's the messages from the compiler. So first, here, the 3. Let's say that I forget to put the 3, and let's compile. As you can see, we have a message that says error expected expression. So let me copy paste this. So here, expected expression here. So you can see that something is missing, line number 4. So it's quite visible here that we miss a number. Indeed, there is a less than character without any value just after it. So it's pretty explicit. So let's put back the 3, and then let's delete the semicolon just after and see what's happening. I compile, and you see the error is expected semicolon in for statement specifier, and it is pretty straightforward that the semicolon is expected just after the 3, just before the I++. All right, so this one is good. Let's try to delete the closing parenthesis and see what's happening. So if I compile here, we have an error and note, error expected closing parenthesis, so this is very explicit, and the note is quite explicit to match this opening parenthesis, and this is for the for, so it's quite explicit, and I can correct it very easily. Then let's try to delete the opening brace. Compile, and here let me copy paste this message because it's not quite explicit, and this is what I wanted to show you also, is that during the compilation process sometimes you will get some of these errors that are very confusing. Here, for example, it says that line number 8, which is the return 0, there is an error expected identifier or opening parenthesis. So it has nothing to do with the opening brace for the for. So sometimes you see that the compilator, the thing that compiles the code, is also confused when you make these kind of mistakes. So sometimes you have to get through some of the errors and try to find by yourself where it comes from. For example, here, if we see the next error, extraneous closing brace, then that's a hint. It's a hint because we have indeed one closing brace for the main. We have a closing brace expected for the for, but if you see here, there is a missing opening brace. So the compiler didn't catch this error quite well. So you have to figure out sometimes by yourself. Let me show you another kind of error that is quite confusing. For example, if I miss the closing brace here for the for, so I delete it, I compile, and look at the error we have in the messages in the bottom. I copy paste it here. So expected closing brace, line 9. So it's quite confusing because it is supposed to be line 7, but sometimes the compiler doesn't know where to put the closing brace actually. Because here you could put the closing brace line 5 or line 6 or line 7 or line 8. But because we arrive to the latest closing brace, there is no closing brace after this one. So it says, well, we expect a closing brace because we have two opening ones, one for the main and one for the for, and we have only one closing one. And indeed, it says, well, to match the opening one from the main, because the compiler thinks that the latest one is to close the opening one for the for. It cannot distinguish between the opening one for the for and the opening one for the main. So that's another confusing error, and you'll have to correct by yourself, looking very carefully where you open the brace and where you have to close it. And let me do something else quite interesting here. If I miss the for opening brace and the for closing brace, and let's compile. As you can see here, I can run the program and there is no error. So what's happening when I run the program? In the terminal, you can see we have hello, 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 world. So that's exactly what's expected with the C language. When you have a repetition loop here 3 times, but you don't have any opening brace or closing brace, then it will repeat only one instruction, the one that is just after the repetition statement. So just after the for, we have this instruction hello, and it will be repeated 3 times. But only this instruction. That's why we have 3 times hello. And once this repetition loop is finished, then we do the next instruction, which is printf world. And this is what we have in the terminal. Hello, 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 and then world. So if I go to edit mode, what's quite confusing here is that we have an indentation that is the same for the first instruction that is repeated 3 times. But it doesn't make any difference, but it should be like this, actually. And you see here the importance of indentation, this offset, to understand that the repetition is only for this instruction, this printf, for the for, and that this one is after the repetition loop. And here, let me correct, because this is not the behavior we want. So sometimes the compiler will not figure out that this is a behavioral error, and you will have to figure out by yourself using tests, and you will have to run the program multiple times to see if you have the expected output. Well, all that to say that the compiler only checks for the syntactic errors. So if you miss the closing and opening braces, you don't have any syntactic error, but then you don't have the expected program because you wanted to repeat those 2 lines, and because they are not within braces, then you don't have the expected output. Well, so try to to do some other errors. So try to delete some of the other statements or characters anywhere in the code, and try to see if you understand everything in the compiler messages errors, and try if you can correct these errors with those messages. So you have to get used to the compiler errors for the next codecast. Good luck.
Next, we'll learn how to add comments to your code. Comments are there to help you explain to yourself and others how your code is working. Because often it can happen when you look at your own code 5 weeks after you wrote it, you can't really understand it anymore. So comments are very important to help explain what your code does. Here again, we see the program we wrote earlier, which writes blah 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 3 times to the screen, and then blue blue 6 times on a new line. So if we wanted to add some comments here, for example, right here, we would, for example, type 2 forward slashes. That tells you a comment is coming. You can ignore this for the compiler purposes. This is only for the reader. So we might type something like a for loop that prints blah, blah, blah 3 times. And you can see that the editor automatically chose a different color for this text that I typed right here because it's a comment. And so that stands out in my editor. Another comment I might want to add is when the loop ends. So you could type something like end of for loop. Also, that we want to start a new line. So start new line might be another thing you might want to type here. And again, you can see the color of this text is different in the editor because it's a comment. And then you might want to add another comment right here, a for loop that prints blue blue 6 times. All of these are comments started by 2 forward slashes, and these are one-line comments, and they won't influence the execution of the program at all. So if I compile this now and then run the code, nothing has changed whatsoever. What has changed, however, is that I added comments to my code so that I can later better understand how my code operates.
I'm going to show you how to comment some of the lines that include code already. So we have 2 ways of doing that. First is to put the comment at the end of the instruction. For example, here we have a program with 2 loops. Then the first one is repeating 3 times blah blah blah, and then we have a new line with a printf. And the second one is repeating 6 times, as you can see here, blue blue. So if I compile and execute, then we have blah 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 3 times and blue blue 6 times. And to separate the two, we have a new line. All right, so let me go back to edit mode. So I want to comment this code. So what I can do is at the end of each code line, I can put any comment I want to make it more clear for someone that will read the code. So here, beginning of the main. Well, this is, it doesn't serve you. You don't have to say that. This line, for example, I can say specific line used to repeat with the for. This is the start of the first loop. And this is the first instruction inside the loop. And this is the second instruction inside the loop. And this is the third instruction inside the loop. And what is this one? This is the end of the first loop. And well, that prints a new line. And this is the second loop. So the beginning of the second loop. And this is the first instruction of the second loop. And this is the second instruction of the second loop. All right, and this is the end of the second loop. So that's how you put some comment at the end of the instruction. So these ones are very simple comments, just to show you how it works. So it's just a double slash at the end of the instruction. So after the semicolon, or here, as you can see, it's the beginning of a loop. So I put it just after the opening brace, or here, the same for the main, just after. So at the end of the line, if you finish the line with a double slash, then the rest is a comment. As you can see here, it's in different color to say that it's a comment. Something else that I want to show you is that you can comment very easily one line so that it is not executed. So by the way, here, if I compile and run the program, it is exactly the same behavior and the same output because it doesn't change the behavior of the program. But now I'm going to show you how you can comment one line to change the behavior. For example, for the first repetition loop, I can comment the first printf by putting 2 slash before the printf. And as you can see, the printf changes the color and is now a comment, so it will not be executed anymore. So if I compile and run, you can see that instead of having blah blah blah, we have only blah blah. I can do the same with blah, for example. I compile and run. And now for the first loop, we only have blee 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 instead of blah 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 because I just commented the 2 first lines. So you get the point. Anytime you want to do some testing, it's very good to comment some of the lines to see the behavior of the program. So that's a good way to debug a program. Here I just commented the blow line in the second loop. So I only have the blue. And here I have only blee that is not commented and blue that is not commented. And that's a way to debug a program so that you can comment and uncomment some of the lines very easily and see what's happening if you have a certain bug to focus more on the bug. So you can try by yourself and comment some of the line, but be careful because if you comment, for example, the beginning of the first loop, the for, then you will have some syntactic error because you have the closing brace for the for, but the opening brace for the for is commented. So that's a syntactic error. So you have to make sure that if you comment a line, you still keep a certain behavior that is correct to debug your program. So go ahead and try to comment some of the lines here or uncomment some of the lines and see if you can play with the comments within the code.
Now that we know how to add comments to our code on individual lines or at the end of a line, we'll learn another way to put comments in our code, this time comments that go over multiple lines. Here we have a simple program that contains a for loop that will repeat what's inside it 3 times. Inside the for loop, printing blah, 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 and a space after the last one, and then we're repeating that 3 times. So we expect one line on which we see blah, 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 blah 3 times, separated by spaces. Let's quickly compile and run this code. And indeed, we see blah, 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 blah repeated 3 times, separated by spaces. Now let's go to edit, and suppose we wanted to explain what this program actually does to someone. To do so over multiple lines, we would start a multi-line comment by typing / and star. The end of a multi-line comment is indicated with a star and a / so the same two symbols, just in the opposite order. Anything that goes in between is considered a comment and will be ignored by the compiler. So for example, we might type here, this program uses a for loop, and suppose I wanted to start a new line, I can simply hit return here, and the comment continues on the next line. So this program uses a for loop to print out another new line, blah, blee, blee, blow, blue, 3 times. And you can see the color of my text has changed again, indicating that this is a comment. Anything between /* and /* is considered a comment. So this won't affect the execution of my program at all. It's just there to explain what my program does. Let's quickly make sure this actually works. Let's compile and run. And indeed, the program acts exactly as it did before. Let's go back to edit mode, and let's see what else we can do. Suppose you discovered that you actually didn't want these first 4 printf statements in this for loop. You just wanted to print blue 3 times. Well, I could put a /* in front of the first printf statement and a */ behind the 4th printf statement. And now anything between the /* and the */ is considered a comment. So all of these printf statements are actually now considered comments and will be ignored by the compiler. In other words, the only printf statement that will be executed is this very last one. Let's give this a try. Compile and run the code. And indeed, it only prints blue 3 times because we said we would repeat this loop 3 times. Let's go back to editing. And let's get rid of these comment signs now so that our code is back to where it was before. If we now compile and run, the code acts exactly the way it did before and prints blah, 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 blue 3 times in a row. Suppose now I wanted to just get rid of the 3rd and 4th printf statement. Well, I can do that by starting a comment before the first printf statement I want to get rid of and ending that comment after the 2nd one. So now these 2 lines of code all of a sudden appear as comments. And what's going to happen is we're going to print blah, blah, we're going to skip blee, blow, and go right to blue. So what do we expect the output to be? We expect it to be blah, blah, blue, space, blah, blah, blue, space, blah, blah, blue, space, because I'm simply missing the blee and the blow in the middle. Let's compile a code and run. And indeed, blah, blah, blue, blah, blah, blue, blah, blah, blue, as we expected. When we go back to editing, we can again remove these commentary signs if we wish to, and the code is back to its original form. So a multi-line comment can be very useful in quickly commenting out some code that you just don't want to currently use, but you don't want to delete the lines either because you might want to use the code again later. Comments are very useful.
I'm going to show you how to comment multiple lines of code already. For example, here we have a program with 2 for loops that will repeat blah 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 3 times, and that will repeat blue blue 6 times. We're getting used to it. And the thing is, I want to comment the first for loop. So what I do is I go to the beginning of the for, and I comment it like this with multiple lines, so /*, and then at the end of the for, after the closing brace, I put the */. So that means that everything that is between the /* and the */ here is commented, and it will not be executed. So if I compile and run the program, I have only the second loop that will be executed with blue 6 times. And the first one is commented, so it's not executed. The same for the second loop, for example. So let me do that again. I will comment here before the for and after the closing brace. I compile and execute. As you can see, only the first loop is executed and the second one is not. So that's a good way also to debug your program. If you find some errors, you can comment portions of the code just to be focused more on the bug you have and to test only a specific part of the code you want. Something else to notice here is, of course, the first line. So if you comment the first line int I equals 0 with the first for, then you will get an error because the second for needs this first line. What's happening when I compile? Then I get an error, use of undeclared identifier I, and that's exactly what's happening when you don't have this first line here. So be careful when you comment some of the lines that this first line here is needed for the second for. So you have to be very careful of the portion of the code that you comment that is interfering with other portions of the code. So that's how you comment multiple lines of code to debug your program and to disable parts of the program, actually. Something else to notice is that if you already have some comments in the middle here, then if you do a comment around these comments, it will work as expected here. Right, so this whole part is now commented, and if I compile and run, then I only have the second loop that is running. So try it by yourself. Try to comment parts of the code here with multiple lines.